I'm convinced that you can learn a lot about a person simply by watching how they get on an airplane. In fact, I think you can learn so much about it that I've tried to come up with a personality test that it categorizes people, maybe like an internet quiz or something. How many of you taken like a personality quest like Myers-Briggs, or maybe you know your Enneagram number or something like that? I think that you could learn a lot about yourself and other people by studying the personalities that are revealed simply by watching people get on airplanes. Okay, now remember, the most important thing about what I'm about to talk about is the fact that this isn't about right or wrong, except for this one instance, which we'll talk about in a second. It's about understanding who you are and who other people are to give people grace. So first off, there are people, and I need you to admit this if this is you, there are people who they are determined to get to the airport way beyond beyond what's reasonable to be early there. They're like at the break of dawn, okay? How many of you get there super early? Raise your hand, admit it. Okay, I'm not that person, but I've been with those people. I have been at an airport so long, and this wasn't a layover, this was the actual departure, where I ate 3 meals in the airport. 3. Okay? So then there's other people. I'm not going to be cutting it close, but I'm going to be reasonably on time. Then there's people who the division is between how do you trust the airline to handle your luggage? Are you willing to check luggage? Or are you determined to carry as much as possible with you? So I'm the light and the load. I will check everything except for my toothbrush, and I will just I'm not going to carry stuff through the airport. But then there's people, now who is it, admit it if this is you, that you are trying to carry on as much as possible. Right? You've got 3 layers of clothes on. You've got your jacket and your rain jacket. You're wearing a blanket and like a Snuggie or something. You've got a wheelie cart. You've got a backpack and a purse and a bag that looks like you bought something at the duty-free store, just so you can justify all of the different things so you can carry it on. That is not me. Okay? Then there is where you like to sit in an airplane. Where do you like to sit? Now, this is something I just learned recently. I was going to say, are you a window person or an aisle person? Because no one really likes the middle seat. But then people say, I love the middle seat. Who likes okay, let's start with that. Who likes the middle seat? Is anyone willing to admit it? I was watching people fill in. I think it's the people who sit right here, right? Right? If you come in, this place is empty, and you sit right here, you're a middle seat kind of person. But aisle seat versus window seat. Okay, now here is something that I did not even realize was an issue until this last year. I didn't realize there are groups of people who believe it is not just inconvenient, that it is actually immoral and a travesty against God and nature to recline your seat in an airplane. Okay, just notice people got nervous because they're like, oh, he's talking about me. How many, if you're willing, this is a safe space, at least for now, is anybody one of those people? Like, it is immoral to lean your seat back. Okay, I see people. I did not realize this was an issue. Okay, it is my God-given right? I get this extra 1.5 inches after takeoff, right? Somehow this is dangerous, but like this is luxurious, right? So here is an event that transpired. I've been reclining in my seat the moment the wheels are off the ground for I don't know how long. But I got the privilege of going with our students to Israel last summer. And we're flying back, and we've had a wonderful trip at Holy Land. We're tired. I get on the plane, we're all spread out, and I'm not sitting behind one of my students, but I'm sitting there, and plane takes off, and I lean my seat back. Person behind me smacks me in the back of the head, okay? Just boop, and like, okay, so I pull it back up a little bit, okay? The meal, and then if I didn't put it up all the way, okay, so I give her a little bit. And then the meal comes, and so I put it all the way up as is appropriate. And then the meal leaves, and I put the seat back down. Bam, hits me in the back of the head again. Okay, I'm like, what is going on? Okay, and I find a way to fall asleep. And then I wake up, the dreariness that you have in a flight, and you realize she's gone. And the seat wasn't full, so I thought maybe she found a different seat. And so now's my chance. I put the seat back. She comes back from the bathroom, hits me in the back of the head. But she does it from a standing position. Okay, and that's when the stewardess, an employee of the airline I was traveling with, said, ma'am, you can't do that. He has hear this now, right to recline his seat. Okay, so if those of you you have the right to recline your seat. Okay? You can also learn a lot about how a person boards a plane. Some people, the moment they say, now pre-boarding all people who need help, and no matter where they are sitting, they stand up and they're going to get on, right? Like, dude, we're not going to board you for another 20 minutes. Whereas me, I'm like the last guy. I'm the last guy to get on the plane. I'm sitting there. When they do the final boarding call, like, you going to get on? No. I wait till like the steward is like shutting the door, and I'm like the last person to sneak in. But this is complicated with airlines like Southwest, right? Because Southwest, you don't have an assigned seat. You got to pick your seat. And so people treat that like it's the last plane out of Saigon or something. And they're we got to get on. And then there's this weird game of chicken that you play, right? How do we keep from can we get our own row? Can I put me on the aisle, you on the window, and we can get the middle seat to ourselves? All these games that you play to help you get your own row or nobody's sitting in that middle seat. Well, I've come up with an idea. Okay, and that idea is a T-shirt company. I've shared it with you, some of you, and it's. I'm still looking for angel investors. So if you're interested in supporting this T-shirt, you wear it, and it guarantees you will get your own row on a Southwest Airlines flight. Okay, the first model, I have 3 models so far. Always interested in more. The first one says, "I'd like to talk to you about Jesus." Okay. And people are like, "Yeah, just move on. Okay. The second one is, how about that election, right? Like, yeah, the only thing worse than a person who wears that shirt is the person who sits down next to you. I'd love to talk about that election. This is wonderful. And then the third one is ask me about the end times. Okay. Oh, yeah. So that's the one like, oh, no, I'm not going to ask you about the end times. The end times is one of those subjects that just makes people uncomfortable, right? And the only thing worse than the uncomfortableness we all feel is the person who's not uncomfortable and is really excited about it, right? They're like, I brought my notebook. I just happen to have my notebook with me. It's like that fold-out chart that people have. And I'm like, it's one of those things that you go, what is going on? And so a lot of people, in an attempt to not talk about uncomfortable subjects and to not come off as a weirdo or a fanatic, we don't talk about essential doctrines. But there comes a time when you have to consider the whole counsel of God, when you have to not focus on the doctrines that make you uncomfortable and just tackle them. Okay, and when you're dealing with a study like the wisdom of Jesus, it's hard not to ask yourself, what did Jesus say about the end times? You're going to come across a passage of Scripture where he deals with it. Okay, so first, let me start by introducing the topic. Maybe you're new to following Jesus. Maybe you're new to the church. Maybe this is a completely new topic to you. But so end times, last things, the return of Jesus, all focuses on the fact that Jesus, when he died and rose again, he ascended to heaven, and before he did, he promised he'd be back. Okay, he promised. It's integral to what we believe as followers of Jesus. You can't believe in the cross and the empty tomb without also believing that he's going to come back one day. Okay, but the problem is a lot of people have bad ideas about how this is going to happen. We don't take Jesus' advice himself. So before we start, though, I want to give you one word. It's the theological term that maybe you've heard that deals with this subject. That word is eschatology. Eschatology. If you ever see that word, just know it's a fancy word to say end times, right? Like if you want to sound like you're talking about the end times without sounding like you're an AM radio TV preacher, then just use the word eschatology and you'll sound a little more sane. But like I said, though, you cannot stop talking about this subject just because it's inconvenient, because Jesus promised it. In John 14:3, at the Last Supper, Jesus said, if I go away and prepare a place for you, I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. He promised he'd be back. Similarly, at his ascension, after he was raised from the dead, he spent 40 days with his disciples, and on a mountain in Galilee, he was ascended into heaven. And as he was ascended, the angels who were there said this in Acts chapter 1, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up into heaven? The same Jesus who has been taken from you into heaven will come in the same way that you have seen him go into heaven. He said, you saw him go, he's going to come back. It's actually part of, maybe you don't realize this, it's part of every single time we celebrate the Lord's Supper. Most people think the celebration of the Lord's Supper is about his death and his resurrection. It's definitely that. But Paul says in 1 Corinthians 11:26, for as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you declare the Lord's death, when? Until he comes. So the Lord's Supper looks back over our shoulder to a time when a real man was really killed and was really found alive 3 days later. We look present to a time when we believe that Jesus is alive and present by the power of the Holy Spirit, and we look forward to a time when he will come again and bring the victory that he promised to bring us. That's integral to our faith. And so we have to find a way to talk about it without coming off as doomsday preppers or things like that. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at a passage of Scripture where Jesus talks about his second coming and try to understand what it means. It's going to be in Luke chapter 21, starting in verse 25. The relevant passage is in 25. He says this, "There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and there will be anguish on the earth among nations bewildered by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and expectation of the things that are coming onto the world, because the powers of the heaven will be shaken. Then you will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. But when these things begin to take place, stand up and lift your head, because your redemption is drawing near." This is part of a passage of Scripture called the Olivet Discourse. It's called that because it occurred on the Mount of Olives. It's a longer teaching that occurred in Jesus' ministry. Jesus has been in the temple. We're in the last week of his earthly ministry. He has just done the widow's mite thing. He's argued with the Pharisees. And he does what he does every day. He's walking back down the Kidron Valley, up the Mount of Olives, heading back towards Bethany. And they stop for a water break, and he gives a speech there. He gives a teaching to his students, and that teaching is called the Olivet Discourse. It occurs in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and here we're going to look at Luke's version of it, and it tells us a lot of details about the second coming. All right, but before we do so, I want us to realize what's going on. This is more than just a roadmap to the end times. We're going to put this passage in its original context. We're going to look at the questions he was asking, and we're going to look at what he was trying to teach those first followers that first time he taught it. Okay, I doubt that when he gathered those people together on that hill 2,000 years ago to teach this teaching about his return, I don't think he was trying to talk about current geopolitical struggles. He wasn't trying to say, and then there's going to be helicopters and COVID-19 vaccines and all the things that people kind of think are signs of the end times. I don't think that's the primary point of this teaching. So hopefully as we tackle it, we will see that this isn't just the promise of his return, but it's actually a roadmap and a blueprint to how you and I can live every day as followers of him in the light of his return. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to start back up in the context. The first thing you got to do with the problematic passage is put the thing in its original context. So look all the way back up in verse 5. And in verse 5, we get something. Jesus prophesies destruction. Jesus prophesies destruction. Look at the context. Verse 5 says this. "As some were talking about the temple, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and gifts dedicated to God, he said, 'These things that you see, the days will come when not one stone will be left on another, that will all be thrown down.'" They're walking around the temple. This is the center of Jewish identity. This is who they are. This is where sacrifice and worship and money, everything about what it means to be a Jew and a follower of the Jewish God happens around this place. And Jesus just sort of nonchalantly goes, "Oh yeah, all this is going away. Yeah, take a picture because it's not going to be here much longer." And it doesn't say here, but in Matthew it says, as they were journeying back on the Mount of Olives, verse 7, they gathered together and they say, when's this going to happen? Verse 7 says, "Teacher," they asked him, "so when will these things happen, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place?" So it's important to realize this teaching is primarily answering the question, when is the temple going to be destroyed? Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple. He does it not because the temple doesn't matter, but because the reason for the temple has been fulfilled. You remember what Jesus says about what Jesus says about the temple in John 2:19. He says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up again in 3 days." And that passage goes on to say they didn't realize he was talking about the temple of his own flesh. You see, the thing is, Jesus could very nonchalantly dismiss the idea that this temple is passing away in the same way he could say that the law is passing away, not because it doesn't matter anymore, but because the reason it was sent has been fulfilled. Now that Jesus has come, the law has been fulfilled. Now that Jesus has come, the reason for the temple has been fulfilled. Jesus is the new place where heaven and earth meet. Jesus is the better sacrifice. Jesus is the better high priest. Go read the book of Hebrews. That's actually the point. The whole book of Hebrews is telling Jewish Christians, look, the temple has been fulfilled by Jesus. Jesus is the better high priest. Jesus is the better sacrifice. Jesus is the better place where heaven meets earth and God meets his people. That's why Jesus can prophesy it. That's why Jesus can say this is going to pass away, for the time for its existence is no longer necessary. And it really did happen. If you're unfamiliar with this date, mark in your Bible right here, 70 A.D. Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple, and it happened. Okay, the Jews revolted in 68 A.D. Maybe you're familiar with Masada or something like that you've seen videos of or movies about. 68 A.D., they started a revolution. In 70 A.D., the Roman army surrounded Jerusalem, sacked it, and destroyed the temple. And it was fulfilled. Not one stone was left on the top. They pushed all the stones off the top of the Temple Mount. But the story doesn't stop there. Jesus goes on. Jesus predicts difficulties. Jesus predicts difficulties. Starting in verse 8, he starts saying, don't be deceived. He talks about problems that are going to occur for his followers. Problems where people are going to try and mislead. People are going to try and deceive. Verse 8 says, see to it that you are not misled, for many will come in my name saying, I am he, and the time is near. Do not go after them. Okay? The first thing he says, the first difficulty he says is people will try to deceive you. And he says, be careful. See to it that no one misleads you. This is something that's perpetually going on today. This is why people hate talking about the end times and second coming of Jesus, because we are guilty of being deceived and we're not holding people accountable for it. I was a pastor out in California many years ago, and I was down the street, not literally, but a couple of miles away from the guy who wrote 88 Reasons Why Jesus is Coming Back in 1988. This was 20 years later, and the dude was still in business. Right? Sorry, you get one at bat on that, okay? If you're gonna pick a date, if you're gonna be one of those guys who writes a book that says when Jesus is coming back and you're not right, sorry, you gotta close shop, okay? Because you're officially in the category of a false prophet, okay? Similarly, when the second Gulf War started, somebody gave me a copy of a book, and it was like about Armageddon. And I was like, did you see this book? I asked a mentor of mine in ministry, have you seen this book? It's about Armageddon and about this war, and is the sign of the end times? And he pulls the book out, and he reaches on his shelf and pulls out two books on the bottom of his shelf. It's the same exact title, published by the same exact company, with a different airplane on the cover, published every time a war in the Middle East happens, right? I'm like, come on, it is happening. People trying to mislead us. I have people tell me, is Bitcoin the mark of the beast? I'm like, well, I remember getting faxes at church from concerned parents who told me that credit cards were the mark of the beast, right? Come on, guys. Jesus promised that people would try to deceive us, and we haven't listened to him to be wise about avoiding it. But not just that, Jesus promises persecution. He promises persecution. Verse 9, but before all these things, they will lay hands on you. Verse 12, they will lay hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. You will be persecuted for being a follower of Jesus. And he says, don't worry about it, not because it's necessarily a good thing, it's going to be convenient for you, but because look at verse 13. This will give you an opportunity to bear witness. He says, you will experience hardships as a follower of me, and it's there so that you can have an impact for the kingdom. And so trust me that I know it's going to happen, and trust me in the moment. Look at what goes on to say in verse 14. Therefore, make up your mind not to prepare your defense ahead of time, for I will give you such words and a wisdom that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. He goes, trust that I know it was going to happen, trust that I put you there, and trust that I'll be with you in the moment to give you what you need to say. Okay? We need to realize Jesus didn't promise us an easy life. He promised us a significant life, and frequently a significant life leads to persecution and conflict. We shouldn't be shocked, and so he promises. He says he predicted the destruction, he prophesied the destruction, he predicted difficulties. But that's not where the story ends. The story ends with Jesus promising victory. Jesus promising victory. Jesus' answer to this story doesn't end with destruction and persecution and trials and jail. It ends with his second coming. And now this is where the interpretation gets a little complicated. Okay? So if Jesus says in verse 27 of this, of 25 through 27, he goes, "Then you will see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with great power and glory. And when you see these things take place, straighten up and lift your head because your redemption is drawing near." This has caused a lot of confusion because some scholars think, well, this comes on the heels of his prediction about the destruction of the temple. And so evidently Jesus thought after the temple was going to be destroyed, he was going to come back. And it didn't happen, and so Jesus was wrong, and all of us are just living a delusion. That's what some secular scholars think. Other people try to make this whole passage about the end times. That everything that Jesus describes in this and the other places the Olivet Discourse happens, that it's only about the end times. But that can't be the case because we just saw the question Jesus is answering is, when will the temple be destroyed? What I think is happening is this. I think Jesus has just told his disciples something so cataclysmic, it could not enter into their mind what a world could look like where the Jewish God was in control and the Jewish temple was not functioning. That it sounded like the end of the world to them. And Jesus says, look, I just told you a lot of bad things. I promise destruction, I promise difficulty, but I need you to know the story has a happy ending. The two necessarily aren't going to happen side by side, but he wants to make sure you know that the story that God is telling in this world ends in victory, not defeat. That's the point. And so there's a gap. If you go read the book of Mark, in Mark chapter 13, it's underscored most specifically there where it says, where Jesus actually uses terms like of those days, meaning the days of the destruction of the temple, of those days be watchful. But of that day, meaning his own return, no one can know the time or hour. He quoted splits. We're talking about two different things. And so that's what I believe is happening there. I suppose you're saying, like, so what, Steve? I get it. Okay, fine. I'm not one of those guys. I'm the guy who would walk past you if you're wearing this shirt, ask me about the end times. Okay, I'm tired of talking about it. I've learned the point. What difference does it make in my life? That's a great question to ask. So what? How am I supposed to live my life differently today? And believe it or not, I think that's the point. It's the point that Jesus wanted his disciples to ask that first time he taught on this, and the disciples that what he wants all his disciples to ask up until now. Not perpetually getting charts and doomsday graphs, try to figure out which world leader corresponds to which person in the book of Revelation, but to ask ourselves, how can we live as daily disciples in light of his second coming? And so here's a couple of things I think we're supposed to do. One, live in worship. Live in worship. Jesus said that the temple is destroyed. He did that not because the temple didn't matter, but because the reason for the temple had been fulfilled. Jesus is the new temple. Jesus promises to meet you. Okay, live in worship. It has the ability to transform your focus, transform your hope, transform your purpose by taking our focus off our circumstances, off ourself, and putting it where it needs to be. You know, if you go read Psalm 73 sometime, go find a quiet spot this afternoon and read Psalm 73. It's the story of a man who's struggling with all the evil in the world. And he's looking at all the people who are evil and they seem to be prospering and how bad it's getting. And then he's looking at himself and he actually says, did I keep my hands pure for nothing? I'm broke and I'm suffering and the rich people are the dishonest wicked ones. And he's wrestling with it and he can't figure out. And in 73, verse 16, he says, when I tried to understand all of this, it seemed hopeless until I entered the sanctuary of the Lord. The turn in that whole thing is worship. And so we're called, Jesus is trying to say, look, I'm the new temple. So see, because Jesus is the new temple, live a life focused on and serving him. Take the focus off of the circumstances. He promised they're going to be hard. Take your focus off yourself. He promised you wouldn't have what it takes, that you need to rely up on him. And live a life of worship, seeing how he is at work even in your circumstances. So first, live in worship. Second, live in trust. Live in trust. In the midst of difficulties, it's important to remember God is in control. That's why he told us it would happen this way. He said, you're going to be persecuted. People are going to try and deceive you. All this stuff's going to happen. He did it not so we would get roadmaps and stuff so we could be secure in our own interpretations and trust ourselves, but so that we could believe that a God who put us in this situation knew it was going to happen ahead of time. I told you ahead of time this would happen so that you'd know that I'm in control. So we would learn not to trust ourselves and not to trust other people, but to trust him. The best example of this, so Jesus says in John 16:33, these things I've spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take care, I have overcome the world. Jesus promises peace, but that peace is not rooted in calm circumstances. It's rooted in the confident assurance that God is in control no matter what the circumstances. And so learning to live in trust. One of the best examples of what Jesus is doing in this prophecy comes from a gas station by my house. So a lot of y'all know I love road trips, and because I love road trips, I love gas stations, and I love gas station food. And I can tell if a gas station is good or bad. I'm like a connoisseur, right? Like, oh, that's a good one. We'll stop there. And so they built a gas station by my house, and it has a fancy coffee machine. I'll stop there on the way to church sometimes, and I'll buy a cup of coffee. It's one of those fancy coffee machines that has grinds the beans right when you order it. You're gone are the days when they had to say, this was brewed 6 hours ago, right? It's thick as tar and all that stuff. They grind the beans right then. And so I'm sitting there one time, I put my cup in, I select, it's all computer programmed. I'm punching all the buttons, and select my size, and so I can hear it grinding the beans. And then I'm looking down or whatever, and it goes, like it makes this sound like air and water going through it. And I startle. I'm like, oh, what's that? I look at the computer screen, and it says, nothing wrong with that. Like, the computer knew it was going to make a bad noise. The computer knew that people watching it would be disturbed, and it was going to reassure us. It has been pre-programmed to reassure you that noise was expected. And that's the whole point of these prophecies Jesus is saying is, remember when it happened, I told you ahead of time so I know it was going to happen. And because you know that I knew it was going to happen, you can trust me that I'm with you, that I haven't forgotten you, that I've got a plan and it's still at work. Okay, I'm still making your coffee, right? That noise was not the machine breaking. The noise was a regular part of the process. So live in trust, live in worship, live in trust. And then last, live in hope. Live in hope. Jesus doesn't end the story by saying the temple's going to be destroyed, your life's going to be terrible. He ends the story by a picture of the fact that, and then I'm going to come back and it's all going to be perfect. Live in the light of the coming victory. One of the best examples of this, I always love reading. I read it at every funeral I attend. I read it as often as I can. Revelation 21, the end of the story. In case you missed, is the end of the story. Revelation 21. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them, and they will be his people. And God will be with them and will be their God, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more, grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away. Then the one seated on the throne said, look, I am making everything new. I love the fact he says, look. It's like, look, come on, guys. You ever know somebody who used that exclamation, look? It's like how to get your attention. Look, making all things new. I love what a different translation says, behold, I make all things new. Notice he doesn't say, behold, I make all new things. He says, God promises that there's not a single place in this broken world that God's not going to fix. There's not a single place where sin and death currently claim victory that will not be overturned by the power of the resurrection. And he calls us to live in that hope. He calls us to realize that the story that God is telling in this world has a happy ending, which means if it's not happy, it's not the end. How's this hitting you today? Are you one of those people who came in here going, end times, here we go again. Maybe I should have printed one of those shirts and wore it, okay? So people just walk out. I don't know what you need to which part of this you need to hear. Maybe you're tired of talking about it, so therefore you never thought about what you're supposed to get from it. The real thing that a follower of Jesus is supposed to get. Maybe you've been so frustrated or worried or anxious about life that you need to start by living in worship all over again. Maybe you need to turn your mind off of your circumstances and off of yourself and put it on the God who's in control. Maybe you need to live in trust. You've been worried that you can't do it all, and guess what? You can't. And you need to find a way to put your trust in God, who's in control and knows what's going to happen and has put you where he wants you for his glory and for your good. And maybe, just maybe, you just need some hope this morning. Okay, sometimes when we look at the difficulties in our own life and we don't feel up to the challenge, we feel hopeless. Remember, God promises victory. Let's pray. Father, remind us of that. Help us to see the truth of your second coming, that the truth is that because of who you are and what you've done and what you still will do, that you call us to live a life of worship, focused on you and giving you praise for the great things you have done. You call us to live a life of trust, recognizing you've placed us where we are, you haven't forgotten us, you know what's going on, and you're promised to be with us as we go through it. And you call us to live a life of hope, knowing that you promise victory. Whatever part of that we need to hear, Father, press it into our hearts and help us become the people you want us to be.
Hey, Pastor Ryan Rush here, and I just want to thank you for being with us at Kingsland Online today. What an honor. But I'll tell you what would be even better. We'd love to see you get connected with the physical church in the days ahead if you haven't already. And that means maybe if you're local in the West Houston area, we'd love to see you at Kingsland. Otherwise, regardless, we'd love to help you facilitate jumping into a local church near you, and we can do that together. You can go to kingsland.org/onlineconnect. Kingsland.org/onlineconnect to find out next steps on your journey. Listen, thanks again for being with us today at Kingsland Online.